Lime Rock once again delivered on beautiful scenery and crowning yet another 2023 first-time winner. But unfortunately, I think there's something that we didn't see that's gonna be a bigger talking point. Round 7 of the Imsa WeatherTech Sports Car Championship saw the series head to Lime Rock Park. Located in Lakesville, Connecticut, the 9-turn track has been a staple on the Imsa calendar and more recently has hosted a GT-only round of the championship. Now, Lime Rock Park is not only unique in that it's a GT-only round on the calendar, it's also pretty unique in how condensed the whole weekend is. Practice and qualifying went out on Friday, and it's always nice to be able to report that they are relatively incident-free sessions. The only incident that's even really worth mentioning is a small coming together between the 78 Lamborghini and the number 94 Aston Martin. That, though, did not result in any significant damage to either car. And overall, you know, the practice sessions were pretty good. The fields were extremely tight, with virtually the entire field separated by less than a second. And this would carry over into another very tight qualifying session, with actually all 5 of the GTD Pro cars that were entered in this race coming out on top of their GTD counterparts. And quite a bit of discussion so far this season about, oh, you know, the GTDs are beating out some of their GTD Pro counterparts, but in this one, the GTD Pro cars all reign supreme. In GTD Pro was the number 23 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, driven by Ross Gunn, who drove to the pole position with a 50.593 second lap time. He beat out the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus by almost 2/10. And that 5-car GTD Pro field was separated by just under half a second. But it was GTD where things got really close. The number 32 Korthoff Motorsports Mercedes of Mike Skeen took the pole position there with a lap time of 51.15 seconds. He just narrowly edged out the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren by 7/1000ths of a second. And the number 78 Forte Racing Lamborghini was right up there as well. They were just 3/100ths of a second off pole. Now, the extremely close racing on Friday would ultimately carry over to the race on Saturday as well. But unfortunately, in my opinion, and we're going to talk about this more in a second, I don't really think it led to the best racing. As the race got underway, the opening stint of the race was pretty standard. Drivers settled in nicely, but as far as battles went, they were going on, cars were nose to tail, but there weren't really that many passes that were taking place. And as a matter of fact, I mean, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the best battles that were taking place here were actually at the back of the GTD class. One of the battles that we saw was between the number 66 Gradient Racing Acura of Sheena Monk, who was just ahead of the number 77 Volt Racing Porsche of Alan Brynjolfsson. Two of them were duking it out for a number of laps, and there was one point, Alan, I think, probably had a little bit more pace than Sheena, but just couldn't get enough of a run to make the pass into turn 1. He was hammering the headlight flash button on the wheel. I think I made a comment like, he's gonna break the flash button on that wheel. But ultimately, there just wasn't quite enough pace for Alan to be able to get around Sheena. And the other battle that was going on, unfortunately, led to our first full course yellow of the race. You see, the number 94 Aston Martin, at the time driven by Jarrett Andretti, was battling it out with the number 91 Porsche of Alan Metney. Jarrett had been holding him off for a number of laps, and perhaps Metney's patience had just run out and decided to take an extra bold stab up the inside. I think he probably just missed his braking point. But regardless of what happened, that number 91 Porsche absolutely dove into turn 1. The number 94 Aston Martin had absolutely nowhere to go, just an innocent bystander in all this. Got plowed into in the rear, spun off into the barriers, a hard little excursion, I guess you could call it, for Jarrett, and he had to retire the car. He would get out of the car and be fine, but really just an unfortunate way for that 94 to end yet another race for them. This is the second time that they've been taken out. You'll remember back to Laguna Seca where they got taken out by the Porsche GTP. And at the end of the day, Metni didn't escape from this unscathed either. He had to retire the car just a couple of laps later. And I don't think this is going to be the last that we hear of this incident, given how IMSA's handed out some probationary hearings in the past and placed drivers on probation. I would not be surprised if we see Metni placed on probation for the, I think they handed out a 4-race probation for Alex Kirby for a kind of similar style incident at Watkins Glen. Wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar handed out here. Now, during the ensuing full course yellow, all of the GTD teams would basically box and swap out their drivers, get their mandatory driver change out of the way. But in GTD Pro, they were kind of cycling through pit stops prior to the full course yellow coming out, so there was a little bit of shuffling that was going on, and number 79 WeatherTech Racing Mercedes was the big loser in everything. They ended up emerging from this sort of in the middle of the GTD field. And the timing of this caution was also kind of a bit of relief, I think, for team strategy personnel, as it essentially meant that everybody was able to make it from here on one stop. Also notable during this full course yellow was the championship leader in GTD. They had a great pit stop that saw them leapfrog a bunch of teams on pit road, but it was on the release of that pit stop. They would make contact with the number 32 Mercedes on pit road. They would get hit with a drive-through penalty, and they would have to serve that. I think they ended up serving it about 10 or 12 laps after they went green by the time they were actually handed that penalty. But that essentially ruined any opportunity at a good finish for them in this one. And as I mentioned, they are the championship leaders, and we'll just talk about the implications of that penalty and ultimately their finishing position in a few minutes. Now, we would go back green, and really, I would say this middle stint of the race was just a story of two Porsches that were plowing their way through the field, with arguably the only overtaking that we really saw all race. The number 77 Wright Motorsports Porsche, who is now driven by Trent Hinman, and the number 92 Kelly Moss Porsche that was now driven by Julian Andlauer, they were men on a mission. On the restart, they started in 10th and 11th in GTD, but by the time a full course yellow would come out again, they were up to P2 and P3 in class. And this full course yellow was for another GTD competitor, the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren, driven by Brendan Uribe. It looked like he just lost it coming out of the final corner. There was the number 79 WeatherTech Racing Mercedes, I believe, right behind him. Don't believe that there was any contact made, but regardless, he spun out when trying to get down pit road, went hard into the inside tires, and would bring out the race's second full course yellow. The race would go back green with 48 minutes to go, and in both the GTD Pro and GTD classes, we saw basically bumper to bumper action right down to the checker flag. But we did not see a single pass in the GTD Pro class during this final stint, and we also didn't see a single pass take place in the GTD class amongst at least the top 7 cars. Really, the only overtakes that we really saw were for a couple of incidents. The 32 Korthoff Racing Mercedes, they got spun around, and the number 12 Lexus, they must have had an off track somewhere. They had a radiator that was full of grass. They had to come down and make a quick pit stop to clear that out. Oh, and I guess we should probably mention, when they came down pit road, they got hit with a speeding penalty for 44 kilometers an hour over the speed limit. That is not a good look. You do not want to be caught going 44 over, and I think they were hit with a stop plus 60-second penalty for the infraction. Now, the entire final stint of the race, as I mentioned, we saw some extremely close running, with basically the entire podium for both GTD and GTD Pro. They are running nose to tail for the entire final stint. And in the end, it was an absolutely dominating performance put on by the two Heart of Racing Aston Martins. In GTD Pro, it was the number 23 that was driven by Ross Gunn and Alex Riberas that crossed the line first. They finished ahead of the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus and the number 9 Pfaff Motorsports Porsche. While in GTD, it was the number 27, also Heart of Racing Aston Martin, that was driven by Roman DeAngelis and Mark O'Sorensen that beat out the number 92 Kelly Moss with Riley Porsche and the number 77 Wright Motorsports Porsche. Now, I mentioned it was a dominating performance. Well, the number 23 led 146 of 168 laps in this race. I'd say that's pretty dominant. Meanwhile, the number 27 led 91 of 168 laps. Still a very impressive amount of laps led by that car. And frankly, at the end of the day, it just showed how the Heart of Racing was the class of the field in this one. And while I don't want to take anything away from the Heart of Racing and their dominant performance, my main takeaway from this race is not their dominance. It is indeed the lack of passing and lack of overtakes that we saw in this race. Now, I mentioned that we didn't really see any proper overtakes in the final stint of this race. Really, with the exception of the number 77 and 92, and those two Porsches were charging through the GTD field in the middle of this race, we didn't really see that many overtakes at all. And I've thought about it, and I think we can really chalk it up to three main reasons. First, the cars are just incredibly equal. Sure, some might have had a slight advantage in the corners or down the straightaways, but really it all evened out very nicely. And I think, all things considered, the BOP was pretty spot on for Lime Rock. I think the track played a huge factor in the lack of overtaking that we saw. Lime Rock is a super tight track, a super short lap, and it really does not offer many great passing opportunities at all. And then finally, there's the drivers. Now, when things are as close as they are, as I mentioned with the cars, and when a track is super tight, as Lime Rock is, in order to facilitate a pass, you kind of have to force another driver into a mistake, or they just have to make a mistake on their own. And really, there weren't too many mistakes that we saw in this race. You really got to give a shout out to the drivers. The quality of the driving that we're seeing is so incredibly high right now, and really, that showed with the lack of mistakes that were made. You kind of put all those three things together and you kind of end up with the race that we witnessed here. A race that didn't feature that much overtaking, and it sure as heck didn't help that the full course yellows fell at the times that they did and didn't really allow any great strategy to unfold. Those full course yellows basically came out with 2 hours to go in the race, and then the final one came out with just about an hour left in the race. It took any potential strategy kind of out of the hands of the teams. And then maybe it just seems a little bit more disappointing because of the absolute incredible racing product that we've seen so far this season. I mean, we certainly have been spoiled on that front. But really, I think at the end of the day, the competition was extremely close, which was great to see. But the racing itself just didn't really deliver in this one. But what did you think? Do you agree with my take that, the racing maybe under-delivered a little bit? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Jumping into the point standings now, and with the number 23 Heart of Racing's win, I mean, they're pretty far out of the championship hunt, so Lexus still managed to finish second and gained more points on their competition, if you can believe that. They lead the championship in GTD Pro with 2,462 points. That is a 151-point gap on the Corvette Racing number 3. It pretty much looks like that championship is just going to be a battle for second, third, and fourth at this point. However, in GTD, this is where it gets interesting. I mentioned earlier the number 1 Paul Miller Racing's difficult day that they had at Lime Rock. They still lead the championship with 2,226 points. That is 86 points ahead of the Heart of Racing Aston Martin. So within 100 points is the 27. They are the only car that really has a shot at catching the one here, as the number 12 Vassar Sullivan Lexus is the next closest car, but they are 255 points off of the number 1. When it comes to picking a couple drivers of the day, I think my life couldn't be that much easier. Ross Gunn in the GTD Pro class was absolutely outstanding in this race. In a race where everyone was so close in pace, he really stood out above the rest. He bolted out to a lead in the first stint especially, and whenever he was in the car, he just looked absolutely in control of this race. And in GTD, I gotta stick with another Heart of Racing driver here, is Roman DeAngelis. Absolute masterclass in GTD. I feel like whenever I do these, I'm kind of always talking about DeAngelis, and it's because he's put on a bunch of absolutely stellar rides this year. It kind of makes me wonder, like, how the heck is this guy still a silver? You gotta think that he's gonna be getting bumped up to a gold license before too long. But he's just consistently there with the lap times of gold and even platinum drivers. And this race was just another really impressive showing for him. Now, there weren't any prototypes that were present last time out at Lime Rock Park, But the 3 classes of prototypes will return once again for the next round at Road America. And speaking of those prototypes, there's a new GTP manufacturer that's going to be joining the Imsa grid next year. But it appears likely that they are going to miss the season opening Rolex 24. You can learn all about the new Lamborghini SC63 right here. Huge shout out to all of the Patreon supporters. If you too want to support the show and get some behind the scenes monthly updates on Off in the S's, then you can check out patreon.com/offinthes's. Once again though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.